Well, good afternoon and welcome to our latest Tech Talk of 2021 as we explore sustainable and responsible data, how tech and innovation will reduce risk and ultimately improve performance. My name is Jill Painter. I am head of IA Engine and our FinTech Hub and Accelerator. We know that institutions, financial professionals and consumers around the world are increasingly factoring in environmental, social and governance considerations into their decision making. Indeed, there is a proliferation of data out there, but are we actually using it effectively? Understanding the impact of our investments and what impact they have on society and the environment has never been so important. Putting ESG now at the heart of the investment process is absolutely becoming BAU. Indeed, the integration of ESG underpins most, if not all, debates around the future of investments. The use of data, coupled with forward-thinking technologies, allows for informed investment decisions, reduced risks and greater performance. But as we all know, with so much data available, what are the central factors? Where are the gaps? And is it really possible to compare apples with apples? Well, today we're going to discuss this and much more. And we have a fantastic lineup of industry thought leaders. I'm delighted to introduce to you, and if you wouldn't mind waving, this would be great. I'm delighted to introduce Amanda Young, Global Head of Investment at Aberdeen Standard, discussing the ESG landscape. What are the established and emerging areas of focus? Kieran Gallagher, Executive Director at IHS Markit, exploring what the data really tells us and how technology will enable consistency and comparative capability. Kikan Alu, Senior Associate at Clifford Chance, examining how new domestic and international initiatives and regulations will direct industry behaviour in the UK. And finally, we conclude with a panel session moderated by our very own Galina Dimitrova, Executive Director at the IA, along with two of our latest engine innovators, ESGI and Net Purpose. Welcome Mark Davies and Dina Kohler. But before I hand over to Amanda, a bit of housekeeping and just one very quick question. So from a housekeeping perspective, please, we do encourage you to use the chat facility to ask questions at any point. We're incredibly keen to make sure that we answer your queries and make this as interactive and discursive as possible. During the session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. The event is being recorded and will be available at a later date on the IA website. Your feedback is super valued and incredibly important to us. So at the end of the session, there will be an evaluation form to complete. And finally, of course, apologies for any cats, dogs, delivery men or children that make an unplanned appearance today. So before we get started, I do just have one very quick polling question that will come up on the screen any minute now. Here it is, just great. So if you could just answer this question: how confident are you in your ability to provide greater transparency into your ESG metrics as required by SFDR? Is this something that you've not yet looked into? Is it something that you're at the early stages of and building out the necessary capabilities, or is it something that you're completely ready for and very confident? We'd really appreciate your thoughts around this question, and we will reference the results during today's session. It's just a couple more seconds if you could just take your time to answer that. Great. Well, thank you very much. And that's enough for me, but it's really interesting to see that the majority are very much at the early stages of building out capabilities. I'm sure our speakers will look at this and comment on it further in today's session. So without further ado, I shall leave you to Amanda, and Amanda will talk to us today about the investment and ESG landscape. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Gillian. So like Gillian, I've also got a poll, so I'm going to kick off with that, and then I will go through what I plan to cover today. The poll should be popping up. Um, that's not my poll. Well, there were 4 answers. Anyway, what is the biggest data and tech challenge for the responsible industry today? So is it the availability of investment level information? Is it platforms for data integration? Or is it the nature of data that we're dealing with? So if you could all answer now, and then we'll be able to record your answer. Hopefully the answer will pop up any minute. There we go. We have equal winners between the availability of investment level information and the nature of data. And I think that's a really good response, because I think it will touch, that reflects some of the things that I hope to touch on today. So thank you very much for participating in that. So before I go on to talk about a few examples of what we're doing at Aberdeen Standard Investments, I wanted to cover a few things. Where we've come from in terms of the responsible investment landscape and what it looks like now. Also, technology driver as a growth in RI, because it definitely has been a driver. Benefits of data and tech, and the challenges and the gaps that we're seeing, and mapping those gaps. And I think there'll be lots of discussion around that today. And then finally, I just want to talk about a few examples of what we're doing internally, so to kind of bring it to light. So if we start off with where we are today and where we've come from, the investment landscape is really interesting. It's the first investments ever made in a formal way, in a stock market way, were in the 16th century, where the Dutch East India Company sought investment to create the first sort of public company. Now, at the time, there were some boycotts against the company because of its involvement in the slave trade. Now, interestingly, those boycotts failed, and they failed for a primary reason, in that the Dutch East India Company ended up being held by a handful of wealthy individuals. Whereas today, the stock markets are no longer like that. Even 100 years ago, it was still the preserve of the wealthy to invest. Today, we all have investments. We all have pension funds. We all have savings. And so the stock market is actually owned by the person on the street. Now, with that comes a voice. And this has been a large part of the driver of responsible investment. So we're conscious and understanding of how companies operate, the impact that companies have on the environment in which we live, the ability to be a force for good, as well as a force for the not so good for society and the environment, in terms of exploitation and abuse of our natural resources. So if we think about that, we then bring in the tech bit, the data bit. Why has that become a hot topic? And it's become a hot topic because of the availability of information. So even in the 20 odd years that I've been in the responsible investment industry, we're no longer sitting looking at physical reports. Everything is on screen. Everything is now at the touch of the button. We can get data instantaneously because of the rise in social media. So when BP had its spill, Macondo spill, literally within minutes of that spill happening, there were, that people were able to see what was going on, and it's even more so now than that particular incident. So companies cannot operate in isolation. What they do, the products they make, how they behave, are all very, very publicly available to society, which has driven the understanding that companies need to behave responsibly, but also that we have a voice when it comes to investing in the landscape that we have. So that's where we've come from. We've come from a real change, a shift in attitude to public corporations, ownership of public corporations. But the big driver for me, the second piece I wanted to touch on, is this growth in technology, this access to information, this ability to understand where companies operate, how they operate, and the impact that they have on the world. So that's obviously been driven very heavily by the information that is now available to us very easily. And so because there's nowhere to hide, companies really need to be thinking about how they are responsible corporate citizens. Now, what is the benefit of data and tech? It gives you that access. It gives you, the ability to understand. And we very much in the investment industry have a philosophy of what is measured is managed. So when it comes to data, what we want to see is the measurement of a policy. So, a company will set a policy, a strategy, a health and safety policy, for instance. You will then want to know how that policy is being implemented throughout the organization. You will want to set yourself targets, health and safety targets, reporting targets, and then all of that data gets recorded up at the highest level. So it gives you a sense of being able to really kind of have a starting point with the companies. That broad raw data is useful, but it doesn't put the context into what companies are doing. So the second element is that dialogue, and this is where stewardship in a responsible investment sense is really important. We need to have the dialogue with companies to understand whether what we see on paper, what we see in the data is actually reflective of company management who are running both private and public entities. Now, this is a gap because technology hasn't quite worked out how to capture that element, and data is backward looking. So we can use data to assess trends. We can use data to say health and safety statistics have been really good, and then all of a sudden there's a blip. So then the question is, why is there a blip? Is this a fundamental problem that's happening within the company? And it gives you ammunition to have those conversations. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give you that sense of what is the forward-looking ability of this company to manage these risks within their business. What's the likelihood of this company in the future to have an impact on society and the environment? So we've got the benefits of data because it helps us understand just how well investments are being managed, but not by us, not investment managers, but actually by the management of those investments that we're making. But there are some significant gaps in ESG data. So the first I will touch on, and it was highlighted a little bit in that poll, is consistency of data. So if we go back to health and safety as an example, different companies will report different health and safety metrics. And so then being able to make comparisons becomes quite difficult because you're then comparing apples and pears. So somehow to bring consistency to ESG data is really important. And we have seen quite a significant move to that consistency with reporting standards and regulation coming through in terms of the expectations of how companies should be reporting, and no more so than in carbon data. So we now have a global set of measurements for understanding what a company's carbon footprint is, and I'll come on to talk about carbon footprinting in a bit. But this is one area that has been successful because every company around the world has to report its carbon metrics, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. It's very clearly defined. And when you've got companies with clear measurement metrics, it makes it easy to roll that up and aggregate that data. But again, carbon data is backward looking, not forward looking. And we as investors need to be thinking about forward looking data. So this is one of the big challenges that we are starting to grapple with. The other big issue that we as an industry face is mapping. So if I take a public markets context, we are able to get data from data providers who have gone around and tried to gather consistent data for all companies around the world. But if you operate in the fixed income and you want the market in the corporate bond market and you want that same data, you then need to map that data to the underlying bond to the issuer. And the question comes from, do you assess what the issuer is doing, or the parent that bond is then mapped up to. So the picture becomes quite complicated in a fixed income context, because A, you've got this big mapping issue. How do you map bonds? But B, you have the double complexity of, well, you can map it, but even if you do that, is that the right thing to do, or should you be actually looking at the issuer rather than the parent company? And finally, in the fixed income space, you've got private issuance. So if you are John Lewis, as an example, you are not a publicly listed company. You've got great disclosure, but this is a rarity, but you might issue bonds. London Transport, other entities, government-owned entities issuing bonds, that then becomes difficult because they have less of a requirement to report, and then that feeds into the private markets. So how do you assess ESG risk in the private markets if the private investments you're making don't have that data to start with? And then how do you aggregate that up, because it's not publicly available? So those are some of the things that we are dealing with within the investment industry. And now just to touch on a couple of examples of things that we are doing. So I've got 3 slides to help illustrate these examples. And the first is around our ESG house score. So on this slide, you will see Power BI as a tool that we are using to bring this data and visualize the data. Now, this is a great way to visualize data to see where your data is, but there are limitations, and I can come on to talk about that. So being able to visualize your portfolio data, I think, is really important for any investment manager. And what we have done is we have developed our own in-house proprietary ESG house score, which is using externally provided data, but we are constructing it in a way that assesses what we think are the material risks of the companies that we are investing in. And we look at both the operational data of a company, so how does a company operate, and how a company is governed, because we feel that E, S, and G is too crude. And again, that comes back to the nature of data, which we saw in the polling questions. And what you are able to do here is you're able to see what your portfolio looks like against how we assess a company operating and how we assess a company being governed. And that's the other thing about amalgamating data at a top level. You could water down some of the risks that you may wish to see within your data set. So we are able, within the Power BI tool, also to go down at a granular level and have a look at its carbon footprint and climate change strategies, its employment issues, how it manages its human rights, how it looks at business ethics, deals with controversies, and how it's governed. So we have a 6-element piece, and you can scroll down, because people want to know what the granular data is that feeds up into an overall ESG score. The second slide is carbon footprinting. So I've already spoken about the fact that this is one area where there is consistency. So you are able to assess within your portfolio what your carbon footprint looks like. And there are different ways of doing this. So, and there are different methodologies of measuring carbon footprint, but you are able to have a look at what the direct exposure is in terms of scope 1, indirect scope 2, and then up and down the supply chain, the value chain under scope 3. And again, we've got the challenges on the slide. The data's backward looking. There can be data gaps and inconsistencies, particularly around scope 3 emissions, and it doesn't provide a forward-looking view of the business strategy to transition. So the third slide is what we're trying to do in terms of assess what that forward-looking view is for climate change. So we've worked in partnership with Planetrix to build our own internal bespoke scenario analysis. So we have not just gone and bought off-the-shelf scenario analysis. We want to be able to use our own insights from our economists and people who are looking, all the different investment teams who are looking at that future state to assess where their portfolios will be under different scenarios. So we've taken the scenarios, we've captured in the economic shocks that might arise in the climate space from our own views to those scenarios. So indirect impacts, including physical risks, so changes to the GVA, You've looked at the direct impacts as well, in terms of direct costs, in terms of taxes and those sorts of things, as well as the physical risks in terms of acute damage and events that you can't account for. You can then map that data to your own exposure, and you can see what your potential impact would be on your portfolio in a future looking scenario. So that rounds up my presentation today, to give you a sense of where we've come from, some of the challenges around some of the data gaps that we're still facing, and then a couple of examples of how we are putting that into practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was incredibly insightful and really interesting to, really interesting scene setting, and, listening to, how you've embraced some of the benefits of, the data and technology that we have today. I'd now like to introduce you to Kieran Gallagher, Executive Director at IHS Markit. Over to you, Kieran. Thank you, Amanda.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick intro on myself. I currently run Markit's EDM warehouse platform. It is effectively a data collection and data management utility we use within asset management to collect data about investments, issuers, counterparties. I'm going to do a quick presentation in terms of where IHS Markit is seeing the trends, and we're not going to talk about IHS Markit product. We're going to really talk about the trends and what was needed to do to address those. IHS Markit's a little bit unique in the fact that we are both a solutions provider, but we are also a provider of information and data. So we have a lot of tools that we've evaluated and looked at as part of that framework. And a big thing what we'll do today is, when we're talking about scenarios, we will eventually get to different approaches that we've used to kind of address those, and that might be useful for you for reference purposes. If you could go to the next slide. So, the first thing we would say is the last few years we've seen a significant uptick in demand in terms of ESG ratings and metrics data. We've launched our own sustainable finance research database. Within my platform, we've added in reporting templates and report collections around those particular data. The real challenge that we've seen is that the growth of the data and the ability to manage data has become a critical component for what I'll call the data stewards and data operations teams. And the reason why is because the data has become a high demand component of gathering assets. So if we look at the space, I believe in 2020, the estimate was that ESG investing had grown to about 50 billion in overall AUM, up from, say, about 30 in close to 2018 into 2019. So we're seeing a significant shift in assets, and the space is constantly growing. That means that major asset allocators, pension funds, government NGOs are coming to and asking more and more for information about the investment process, how ESG factors into it. It becomes a part of those RFPs and RFI kind of questionnaires that people are asked to see. So documenting that process and getting those data points together becomes a big piece of things for our clients, and it drives demand. Due diligence questionnaires and data that's filed with different research databases, whether it's something like an eVestment in the public space or whether we're looking at Cambridge in the private market space, all of these different DDQs and questionnaires are demands on that time of those reporting and operations teams to make sure that the right metrics are published so that they're included. And then when we get into the more end state artifacts, they have become more and more demanding in terms of marketing collateral. So whether it's carbon metrics or whether it's ESG rating score at the fund and the top asset level, there's more and more data appearing in different types of artifacts. And then the last is probably the most demanding one, which is regulatory reporting. And it's interesting to see with SFDR looming in the end of this year in terms of first delivery, and that people are still moving towards getting that initiative underway. But we're seeing a big demand in terms of that regulatory reporting shift. And it's not just going to be SFDR. Obviously, we've seen regulatory initiatives launch in Hong Kong. SEC is now giving new disclosure guidance. That's going to become a recurring theme, that there's going to be different guidance in different markets in different regions, some focused on in terms of data capture, some focused in terms of disclosure and explaining your process. But all of these really factor into challenges that these kind of applications and software platforms kind of have to address within here. With that in mind, I'd say that we're going to look at the challenges that are unique there. And I think when we look at the polling questions, that concept of, you know, the nature and the availability of data, or there's two recurring themes that I think Amanda caught on, and we'll catch on here is that, you know, there's a lot of diversity in the underlying data. So the nature of the data is that it's quite diverse. It's also quite fragmented in terms of how it will come. So we see different providers giving different metrics, different hierarchies, different factors, different underlying categories of data, and different terms. So the definition component can be very, very problematic, because as users are looking at these things, they may see data from provider X and provider Y will give two different definitions for the same metric. So getting consistency in terminology, the standards are helping, but we haven't seen enough of a push for standards across providers. So a lot of the data is really being managed within different operations, and that concept of a house score that was mentioned in the Aberdeen presentation is something we've seen a lot of people do. They've started to create their own consistent internal definitions across providers, and that takes time and effort. The other thing is the shift in terms of the granularity of the metrics. You know, that concept of the data that comes in on regular intervals from corporate filings and corporate research reports and due diligence questionnaires that asset managers put out to their firms, those are good points, but we've also got controversy events, screening events, environmental issues, lawsuits, things of those nature that are now have to be factored into that kind of shock, or those controversies that affect the overall view of that company from an ESG perspective, and that has to factor into those repeatable or annual kind of surveys. The big challenge also is that once we have the data collected, reporting that means that we have to report on different interpretations of data across different regions and across different sectors. You know, what we're seeing more and more is within something like SASB versus GRI. SASB has taken a focus on looking at things from a materiality within a sector. We had NFDR really drive in the European markets this concept of what materiality would be within a sector or within a particular issuer. So those interpretations, you know, users have to think about that from a definition and collection perspective, because it does change the use and the shape of the data when they're thinking about reporting and they're thinking about those regulatory filings. And the last thing is the other piece is that availability, the gaps across coverage across all asset classes, market segments. In the prior presentation, we talked about you know, public equity markets versus bond markets. We also see this challenge pushing into the private asset region. So IHS Markit has a big investment in terms of private assets, meaning private equity investments. We're seeing, you know, the LPs being more demanding in terms of what data is available on the portfolio companies that they're being invested in through these general partnerships. The general partners themselves are also pushing demand down to these private companies. But again, a lot of this data is dependent on a lot of manual collection. So we start to see, you know, an inconsistency in terms of the availability of data across segments and the availability to get all that data down to the individual investors. Next slide, please. So, you know, when we look at this data, you know, what the challenge is effectively the nature of the underlying information. While there are providers in the space, and IHS Markit is actively engaged in the space of collecting filings data, centralizing data across this, a lot of that data is coming in unstructured, or what we'll call semi-structured data sets, whether it's annual reports, corporate filings, research data, individual investor questionnaires or due diligence reports. You're starting to see that more and more data is coming off of PDF, more data is coming out of Excel, and so these structured data sets create a challenge in terms of data collection, because, you know, the world we live in public markets is largely driven off of fairly regimented data, whether it's Refinitiv, whether it's Bloomberg, whether it's IHS Markit, whether it's ICE. They're typically well-documented, well-defined formats within here. Teams have had to make more and more investments in tools that will deal with the data collection around these semi-structured and unstructured data events. So when we're looking at those kind of components, we also have to think about managing completeness, managing validation, managing checking, because it's not just simply about being able to scan or read a PDF. It's about materially being able to validate the data coming out of that and giving investors and users transparency into where that data was sourced from, what validations it went through, what checks were going into that place, into there. And as I said in a prior section or prior slide, private assets is confounding that. What we're seeing is pushback from private companies because of the onerous collections when they have multiple investors, different formats, different questionnaires. It becomes a challenge. So the timeliness and completeness of the data can be a problem in terms of getting information into users' hands so that they can complete their due diligence, complete their reviews, make sure things are in place. So what we've tried to see is that we're trying to standardize collections, simplify filing information, and standardize some levels of definitions in terms of making sure that we can deal with variations in data across different providers and different systems. So for us, it's really critical that we look at these. Currently, I'd say a lot of the centralized data feeds, they're very focused in terms of ratings, in terms of opinion data, but the fundamental metrics and the details, users are collecting that and collating that from multiple sources. So the challenge there is you end up building up a very large universe and ecosystem of different vendors. With all of these with different opinions in terms of structure and taxonomy, all of them with different ways to assess the underlying data. The competing taxonomies, and I think the reporting metrics that are coming out now are great, but they're coming in at a pace that's very difficult for teams and operations teams to manage. Next slide, please. What we focused on as a business, and these are fundamental things that we think are effectively required to initiate some kind of standard framework for any company, whether they're using our platform or any third party, is first of all, think about the ability to extend to new data points and metrics. So when we defined our data schema, we started to think about how we would take underlying factors and relate them to categories of data. So how carbon utilization affects our environmental score. What could be the underlying metrics that are in there? Could we restack or create new metrics that would create a new aggregated score? We also thought about the fact that we would want to be multi-tenant or multi-provider, in the fact that our clients may come to us with different data, and that the data that we were going to get could come in large swaths, so we could onboard large volumes of historical data, or we may just be getting current day snapshots depending on availability of data. So we needed the ability to effectively process data in the day, but we also needed to be able to replay data. And I think that's critical because as you bring on providers, people will want to see historical impact. It's going to be a critical factor there. The second component is the concept that when we get into that multi-tenant, multi-provider, we need a way to overlay that data, and we needed effectively a way to address a set of logic and define a set of completeness requirements that will allow us to take data from multiple providers and augment or cover gaps across those providers. We use our rules engine to effectively look across sources, determine our primary source, determine our secondary, tertiary sources, and then we can waterfall within there. If there are multiple providers available, we also need clear guidance in terms of what are the user's preferences for data. And we want to maintain all of that data by source so that if a user says, I want to validate that what we did in our waterfall or in our gold copy construction actually ties out to what I saw in the source data and the source trend. So again, this is a big component of what needs to be thought about when you start to build in that internal research database. And lastly, was the data quality controls. So the ability to compare changes over time and look for outliers or look for deviations or look for significant spikes so those could be investigated. Implement defensive controls to identify inconsistent data. One of the things we see is the cross-reference of global parent and issuer and making sure that data is consistent across both the parent and the underlying companies so that we're aligned in terms of those data definitions and we can track kind of inaccuracies there. And when we have exceptions, when we have outliers, the ability to kind of track and work down those exceptions with SLAs, with transparency to the underlying users, because the most important thing in terms of these reporting and operations teams is confidence that the data is going to be timely and that they know when they're going to be able to report or when they're going to be able to use that data. Next slide, please. Now, once we got to the collection and aggregation, we had to think about distribution. And our big focus was the ability to either take our gold copy source data or our raw data and deliver that to different consumers. Different teams may have different requirements, so we wanted the ability to mix or match those definitions. We wanted to also incorporate or aggregate results at different levels. So we may be applying things at portfolio company, we may be applying things at fund or GP. We want to be able to kind of calculate and aggregate metrics across all of those different components. So the ability to kind of roll data up and those data points in there as well. We also invested in dictionary capabilities. So the ability to produce the same output with different field labels, different taxonomies as part of that data dictionary. So investing in an ability to understand that these data points are alike across providers and just simply have different labels, different categories, or different roll-ups. We wanted to get the underlying factors defined at a level that was easy for us to manage and centralize. And then we thought about a framework where we would deliver content as we needed it, whether it's our interactive UI or screens, API calls to feed out trading systems, to feed out risk systems, to feed out portfolio management systems, or the ability to create a filing in some kind of XBRL or some kind of complex data taxonomy. So all of those components needed to be supported to fit all of our different users. And then we thought about things like giving users the ability to see delta, see changes across periods and key changes in periods, the ability to access trend data. So look at all of your portfolio companies and all of their ESG metrics and look at things in trends over time to see if they're progressing or regressing in terms of their ESG scores and their underlying factors. If we wanted to see that data, we also might want to see it historically, or what we call side by side. We always get asked this question, and it's interesting. I want to see my portfolio holdings with either current day metrics or historical metrics. And that may be a way to see how that's progressing. So that ability there, and then obviously the ability to compare across peers. Now, the last thing that we've invested in is also this concept of adding in context or terminology. So we thought that it was important that users, when they're seeing trends, if they're seeing adjustments or revisions, that there could be a concept that disclosures and notes are critical for those consumers to kind of make that data available and more meaningful for them. So it's not just about data, it's also about giving users the ability to capture the interpretation. I'm just going to jump one last slide, and that will be it for IHS. So where we went from an investment perspective, as I said, is we're building out our own taxonomy and multi-jurisdictional, multi-provider model in terms of capturing ESG metrics. And that's a universe of data and a data feed that we've kind of invested in as a product. We've also invested in that data dictionary and that glossary component so that we could more easily, as a software provider, integrate data from multiple providers and get users to a consistent data definition, or allow them to build a consistent data definition in that dictionary platform. AI has been a huge investment across market, not just in ESG, but across all of our businesses in terms of that document extraction and capability. So the ability to scan, read PDFs, but more importantly, give users the ability to review that data, then tie out that data, and potentially give users the ability to link through from a data point on a screen to the source PDF or the source document. So the demand for lineage from what's on a screen or what's on a report back to the raw sources, whether it be a file or whether it be a PDF, is something that we see more and more demand for. And as we're taking all of this data on, we've started to use our data lake and our data catalog technologies to empower data scientists by giving them access to large pools of information, giving them the ability to plug in machine learning platforms to our historical research, whether that be our ESG data, whether that be our pricing data, or that be any of our other fundamentals databases. So we think there's an emerging capability around data lake and machine learning that requires a huge pool of information. So we're investing in that kind of component. And then lastly is within our platform, we always think about things from a user interface and reporting tools and development perspective. So within my team, we're constantly focused on how users want to surface data, how they want to graph, how they want to build dashboards, and we want to improve that user experience constantly around navigation and navigation across time and navigation across between two different products. So those are kind of the investments that market's been making in terms of ESG. I think that would be my last slide.
That's fantastic, Kieran. You covered an awful lot in a very, very short period of time. So thank you so much.
I'm going to take a breath.
Yeah, it was very, very informative. But I'm now going to hand over to Kikan Alu, Senior Executive at Clifford Chance, who will discuss the domestic and international initiatives and regulations and how that will direct industry behaviour in the UK. Over to you, Kikan.
Thanks, Jill. Can I have the first slide, please? So over the next sort of 15 minutes or so, I'm going to look at some of the international and national initiatives that have come down the line in recent years, the impact these are having on the industry, and the challenges faced by the industry, some of which we've already touched upon in the earlier presentations in respect to the relevant requirements. So just looking at the international initiatives to start with, it's fair to say consideration, just as Amanda said, consideration about sustainability factors, ESG factors, is not new. It has had lots of international attention over many years. So for example, we had things like the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investments, which was spearheaded by then Secretary General Kofi Annan, which sort of provides a global framework for investors to consider ESG issues in their investment decision making and ownership of assets. We then had the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights in 2011, which sort of provided the first global standard and guidance for due diligence guidance for preventing and addressing human rights abuses where these are linked to business activity. Fast forwarding into the next the last 5 years or so, we had the Paris Agreement, which was signed up to by something like 191 member state parties, each of which committing to implementing measures to achieve a target of holding global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit increased temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then we've had the UN Sustainability Development Goals in 2015, which was set out in the 2030 Agenda for sustainable development, and it's focused on things like eradicating poverty, provision of clean water and sanitation, quite active. The EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which I'll come on to in next slides. In respect of the UK, what's happening here? Well, we've got the UK Green Finance Strategy, which was published in 2019, and it sets out the UK's approach to greening financial systems. We've also had guidance from the FCA on things like ESG disclosures and reminding firms of the obligation to make sure that disclosures are fair, clear, and not misleading. We've had proposals in respect of the UK focused taxonomy, and we've also had strong commitments by the government to match the ambition and objectives rather set out in some of the EU measures, which we'll discuss in the next 5 minutes or so. Next slide, please. So just moving on to the next slide, what has the industry response been to some of these international initiatives? Well, I think it's fair to say that note has been taken. We can see in the comments by Larry Fink in his Dear CEO letters, the most recent one being that in earlier this year, that especially asset managers, institutional investors are using their influence and their powers to get investee companies to change the way in which they behave, to align themselves with ESG goals, to take steps to meet some of these objectives set by the wider international community and indeed in national measures. But one of the strong criticisms that have always been labelled about some of these more international measures is that they lack teeth. They take the forms of principles and guidance, and firms can disregard them or claim to embrace them and then do nothing at all. So I think we're slowly seeing a shift to more hard legislative requirements, and which we'll see on the next slide, please. So on the next slide, we see details of the EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. This is an example of that move towards more hard disclosure, transparency, process and requirements that will help in implementing some of these wider commitments. The EU's action plan is the EU's response to things like the Paris Agreement, to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, to the 2030 Agenda. And we've seen a package of measures come down the track in that respect. We've seen the taxonomy regulations, we've seen the disclosure regulation or SFDR, we've seen proposals to amend benchmark regulations, and we'll also see amendments to the MiFID II delegated acts, which I'll go into in a little while. On the next slide, it's just a timeline of where we are in terms of these measures, what is next in terms of implementation, when things are going to be enforced, just for your reference, so that you have that sort of bird's eye view of some of these measures, which I'll speak into, and hopefully will assist and aid in your own implementation plans. Next slide, please. So starting then with the taxonomy regulation, this has been described as the green dictionary for sustainable investments. It provides a criteria for establishing whether an economic activity, for example, data storage, is in fact environmentally sustainable. It will apply to all measures adopted in the EU or its member states that require products to be environmentally sustainable. In order to be environmentally sustainable, an economic activity must meet the 4 criteria set out on the left-hand side of the slide in the blue boxes. So it must contribute, for example, to one of the 6 environmental objectives shown on the right-hand side of the slides. And those objectives are set out in the taxonomy itself, and they are specifically defined to give firms an idea of what they actually mean. So taking something like climate change mitigation, that is specifically in the definition linked to objectives of the investments. Taxonomy imposes certain disclosure obligations. In respect of the disclosure regulations at SFDR, those will apply only in respect of Article 8 and Article 9 products, so-called light green and dark green products. And the taxonomy sort of represents that first concrete step in standardizing definitions and criteria across the board, and helping firms get to grips and start to sort of mold and shape the pathway to allow for the comparisons of the different activities that we've heard in the previous presentations. One thing to note about the taxonomy, however, is that it is focused on the E of the ESG. So it is only focused on environmental sustainability. In respect of the S, so social, and G, governance, those aren't in scope, those aren't covered. So there is still an element of fragmentation in respect of those 2 items. But in respect of E, the taxonomy regulation is a game changer, so to speak. Next slide, please. Turning to the disclosure regulation, or SFDR, this is one of the marquee pieces in the EU's green finance package. Level 1 came into force, I'm sure, as you will all know and have been grappling with, in December 2020. In particular, the Article 8 and 9 obligations came into force and were applicable from March 2021. These are the regulation is supplemented by the Level 2 RTS, which is expected to come into force in January 2022. The regulation applies in respect of financial market participants who provide or deal in financial products. So FMPs, or financial market participants, include AIFMs, UCITS, managing companies. Financial products include AIFs, UCITS, pension products, segregated mandates, etc. Disclosures. But more than that, it will require firms to sort of make policy decisions that their disclosures will be based on. And that's where I think we're going to start seeing the change in behavior. Firms will be required to say what they do and then ensure that they do what they say, or face the consequences such as regulatory breach or claims for mis-selling. In terms of the territorial scope, it's important to note that there is no jurisdictional limitation on scope in the text of the regulation. But if you are a UK firm dealing with UK clients, the regulation will not apply. The regulation was not onshored as part of the Brexit process, so it does not constitute retained EU law. But that's not to say that UK and non-EU firms are completely off the hook. I think that the better interpretation is that the regulation will nevertheless have direct application where you are dealing with or marketing funds or distributing funds into the EU, or indirectly where, for example, you are providing services to an EU manager on a delegated basis. It's likely that in order for those EU managers to comply, they're going to push down contractually some obligations to you to assist them in their compliance. In terms of the sort of the obligations and the purpose of the regulation, the obligations are focused on tackling greenwashing, which is broadly where claims are exaggerated and misleading, and therefore mislead investors in respect of the products that they are investing in. The categories fall, the obligations fall into three broad categories. So there are obligations to consider and integrate sustainability risks in your processes, obligations in respect of principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors, and then there are product-specific obligations. There are obligations at entity levels in terms of disclosures, and then disclosures at product level. Taking entity level disclosures first, firms, irrespective of whether they are the relevant fund is an ESG fund or not, the firms must publish on their website disclosures on how they are integrating sustainability risks in their day-to-day decision-making processes. Firms also publish due diligence policies on the principal adverse impact of their investment decisions on certain sustainability factors. And this is mandatory for large firms, so those with 500 employees or more. But in respect of small firms, it's these obligations. This obligation applies on a comply or explain basis. Finally, firms will have to update their remuneration policies, and again, put these on their websites to include the consideration of sustainability risks. Now, EU managers have always been, or have in recent years at least, been subject to rules around having policies in place to prevent excessive risk-taking, but now they'll have to integrate sustainability risks in those policies as well. At product level, firms will have to categorize their product into roughly three buckets. So Article 8 products, which are light green products, and these have as one of their objectives the promotion of environmental or social characteristics. Article 9 products, these products are those which have sustainable investments as their only objective, and then everything else. In respect of, once categorized in respect of those products, firms then need to make certain disclosures in their pre-contractual documents, so their prospectuses, their information memorandums, their IMAs, and there are additional periodic reporting requirements and requirements, enhanced disclosure requirements rather, in respect of those light green and dark green products. So firms would have spent the last sort of 3, 4, 5 months categorizing their product into these three buckets. And on the next slide, we sort of see the impact of that. So the next slide on light green and dark green data requirements. Can I have the next slide, please? So that characterizing of products into light green and dark green buckets is quite important. It's quite significant, and we've all seen the increased demand for from investors for green products, and regulators are focused on preventing greenwashing. And one way to do that is to make sure that firms have enhanced disclosure obligations. So in respect of those Article 8 and Article 9 products, firms will have to make sure that they comply with these quite stringent disclosure obligations and ensure that they are obtaining the data that will enable them to substantiate and evidence the reasons why they have categorized their product as a light green product or a dark green product. And we see on the slide there, so Article 10, the website disclosures of the level of disclosure that needs to be made. So on firms' websites. So methodologies used to assess, measure, and monitor the relevant E or S characteristics. They had to disclose their data sources, screening criteria used in respect to the underlying assets, and the regulation has sort of specific templates on which these disclosures are to be made. So there's no hiding place for firms, and it's not a firm's discretion of what they disclose. So in respect of light green products, firms will have to disclose the percentage of the investments that are aligned with the E or the S characteristics. They'll have to disclose the percentage that are sustainable investments and the percentage that aren't aligned with any of these characteristics at all. So in the event that you come to do your disclosures and it turns out that your product is actually aligned with the latter category, so it doesn't meet any of the E or S characteristics or is not a sustainable investment, you're opening yourself up to claims of mis-selling and greenwashing, and the sort of the liability consequences that flows from that. Connected to that is amendments coming in respect of the MiFID II delegated regulations in respect of sustainability preferences. So under proposals coming in 2022, firms will have to ask their clients about their if they want to invest in green or taxonomy aligned products. And if the client expresses a preference for such products, a product will only be suitable if it adheres to those to the ES and G characteristics. So you can see that characterization is very important, and it will have an impact on the products that are offered and how they are marketed, sold, and distributed across the EU and beyond. I'm going to skip over the next 2 slides just in view of time, but suffice to say that in respect of the NFRD regulation and the CSRD, these are bringing in the same level of disclosure requirements and will require sort of enhanced data collection and data interpretation and sort of explaining your processes and what you have done to your clients. Turning very quickly now in the last sort of minute or so to the challenges. There was an interesting survey by Bank of America in 2018, and they found that 87% of millennials and 64% of women said ESG factors played an important role in their investment decision making. So just taking that segment of millennials alone, they stand to inherit something like 80 trillion USD in terms of wealth over the next couple of decades. And even if you took a quarter of that, it's already sort of exceeds the value of the S&P 500. So there's a huge amount of demand, and there will be a huge amount of demand for ESG products over time. But how are firms going to sort of capture that demand and make the most of it and sort of optimize the potential? Well, we've already talked about some of the data availability challenges, and I'll just add in addition that I think we'll get to the position where investors are going to require information from their investee companies. And where you have, for example, a European investment grade or large publicly listed EU company, they may already have the processes in place. They'll be familiar with some of the rules, some of the initiatives that we've discussed on this call. But where you have the small private companies, they may not have the processes in place to gather the data, to provide the data. So we may arise at a situation where a company is either investable because institutional investors can gather the data, or the company is not because the data is not available. There's also the jurisdictional angle in the sense of the differing standards applicable across different territories, and how we're measuring some of these indicators, some of these metrics, that you're having to allow for things like societal norms, societal nuances across different cultures. So optimal labor practices in the EU may not be the same as in the US or in Hong Kong or wherever else. So the ability to do that comparison, to obtain quality data, to be able to then communicate what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you have made the judgment calls is going to be very, very important. Then just looking at the competing requirements, we've been talking about sustainability factors, and they have been given sort of prominence, and rightly so. But we can't forget that the investment decision is made up of other factors. Firms have to also consider things like liquidity risk and counterparty risk and credit risk and market risks. So an interesting challenge, an interesting question for the industry is, what weightings are we going to be giving to all these different risks in the processing of those investment decisions? Finally, looking at the risk of this risk exposure, which I think I've mentioned already, a few of them. So greenwashing, mis-selling. We saw a very early example a few years ago in respect of the Volkswagen emission scandal, where Volkswagen made some claims which relevant regulators and courts deemed to be misleading about the green nature of their vehicles, and they had to pay settlements of up to $20 billion US dollars. So that gives a flavour of the potential risk that firms are exposed to when they make claims about their products. And with that, I think the ability of technology providers, of research providers, of the fintechs to help in starting to crunch that data, to present that data, to analyze that data will be key in making sure that firms are able to mitigate some of those risks and make most of the upsides as we've discussed. Handing back now to Jill.
Jill, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Apologies for that. I thought I was unmuted. So just like to thank you all for your time today, and thank you, Kicken, for that those fantastic insights. I would now like to invite Galina and the rest of the panel to join us. And we've had quite a few questions come in, so hopefully we'll get time to address some of those as well. So Galina, over to you, and I'll leave you to introduce.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for taking the time to join this afternoon's Investment Association webinar on sustainable and responsible investment data. And what a rich session it has been already, and a great segue actually from Kikun on the role of technology in resolving and enabling all of this. Just very brief introductions on my end. I'm Galina Dimitrova. I am Director for Investments and Capital Markets at DIA. But really, for the past few years, it has been central to my portfolio to help members understand and navigate the evolving sustainability and responsible investment landscape. And that has included the significant growth of responsible investment products and strategies, our clients' changing preferences and attitudes, the increased involvement by governments and regulators. And we had just now a great session covering all of the emerging regulatory requirements in that space. And of course, initiatives that bring us all together to work towards an economy, society, and planet fit for the future. So our work really has been multidimensional, but inevitably on almost every proactive industry initiative, consultation response, or implementation of a new piece of regulation, we have come back to data. Quality data that could serve the multiple objectives of the different stakeholders. And it seems that issues around disclosure, materiality, taxonomy, definition, integration on a micro, macro, company or market level all come down to availability, quality, clarity, and consistency of data. So what is the solution to the outstanding problems in this space is the big question. And I'm really pleased to be chairing this afternoon's discussion on whether technology can be that solution and how technology can enable the use of trusted data for social and environmental outcomes within investment portfolios, the factors at play, the gaps, and of course we must come back on the role of regulation and whether we can achieve a place of comparability and consistency. So I'm very pleased to say welcome back to Kieran. Kikun is staying for the panel, and Jill introduced everyone at the very beginning, but I must say how delighted I am to welcome two current members of the DIA's Engine Innovator Program. Both of them are very active in the ESG data space and specifically selected to participate in Engine because of their innovative approach to industry level problems in this space. So a big welcome to Dina Koller, who is a co-founder of NetPurpose, a firm on a mission to make impact measurement effortless for all investors by 2025. And NetPurpose specifically cleans, standardizes, and structures data on social and environmental outcomes of companies and investment portfolios. And I also welcome Mark Davis, who is a general manager at ESGI. ESGI is currently focused on enabling the investment industry to meet their SFDR disclosure obligations. And many of our audience will know that SFDR is perhaps the most impactful piece of legislation many of the institutions have had to implement, some say since MiFID II, but day in and out we hear about the challenges with the implementation of that. So I'm delighted to welcome Mark and their focus on SFDR specifically. So before I turn to our speakers, I do want to remind the audience that we'd love to hear from you. We have received some questions in advance and during the discussion before, but please don't forget you can submit a question at any time confidentially by using the Q&A panel. So I thought I will start with a question to our FinTech firms participants, because we've heard some of the other perspectives, but I'd love to hear from you. What is the issue with data from your perspective? A lot was said about consistency, nature of data, but how do you see the problem? Is it availability? Is it quality? What are the current and possibly future gaps that we need to close? Dina, I wonder whether I can come to you first.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Happy to join and be part of this excellent panel. I would say quality and availability are interdependent in a way, but I'm going to focus on quality for now because there's a lot of data available from multiple sources. We are in a data-rich world nowadays, and that's why computers are so important, and using AI is such a tremendous opportunity. So let's talk about quality, and I think Kikun, you showed a great slide on these two aspects, quality and availability. Quality, I think, also depends on source. So in the world that we live in today, most of us are relying on corporate sustainability reports that are issued under a voluntary regime. I think a lot of our panelists made clear that it can get messy. Kieran showed us that very quickly, and it can be overwhelming. But I wanted to kind of set the stage and calm everybody down, that in a way, the building blocks of ESG are all the same. They're highly regulated. They've been regulated for at least 40 to 50 years, if not more. So we have a lot of knowledge in various domains on what actually ESG means and the metrics that are used, not only by regulators, but the companies they regulate. So they actually ask companies to disclose this data on a regular basis by mandate. So when we built up our database, we referenced not just the industry standards such as GRI, SASB, or CDP. We also looked at how regulators are talking about this data. And you start to see patterns very quickly. And with those patterns, you can then standardize the data that is coming through the pipeline on corporate reports, which you currently collect by hand. But we have started to leverage technology to do quality assurance checks, look at patterns in our data, and are able to flag effectively where there could be something awry with a reported number. And now we're going to be building that out further using, again, AI to better source the data and use the human as the quality assurance check on what the actual AI engine is delivering us via search mechanisms. So the data seems overwhelming. It is actually less so once you start to see the patterns. And corporate reporting, while they report under various different regimes, whether it be SASB or CDP or GRI, actually does have clear patterns. They might use different words, but they're measuring the same thing.
Thank you so much, Dina. Mark, the same question for you, I suppose, but I wonder whether you can unpack a little more the different perspectives. We've heard about the corporate angle, but our audience today is almost all investment managers, and within our membership, we have over 250 institutions. What have you seen in your work to date in terms of the challenges that investment firms faced with collecting ESG information? And are those challenges the same depending on the scale? Do large and small firms have the same issues? And are there already any industry data management best practices that are emerging that firms can already apply? I'd love to hear your views on this.
Great. Thank you, Galina. First thing to say is I don't think there's anything that we've heard about the challenges today that we would disagree with. I think when it comes to quality, completeness of information and lack of availability and the differing standards, those challenges I think are well documented. We do see a couple of things that I would add to the list around certainly publication lag. I think where you're looking to use ESG information for investment decision making, then obviously if it takes 12 months for that information to flow through an organization to get into an annual report or a sustainability report, you won't necessarily be making decisions on the most current information. And that partly comes back, I think, to Amanda's point earlier on around forward-looking data. A lot of this information is backward-looking and with some delays. I think in terms of the size and scale of firms, for smaller organizations, I think, again, Amanda showed us earlier on some really impressive work around the ESG house scores that Aberdeen used today. And I think for the smaller organizations, with less scale, with less data scientists, with less access to technology, it's much harder. And there's a greater reliance on the data vendor community to source that information, to provide index scores, particularly for the smaller firms. And that in itself, I think, comes down to some of the issues that we've discussed around the data being unstructured, hard to access, hard to mine, hard to maintain. It really is a challenging landscape. And so I think certainly for the smaller firms, you know, a heavier reliance on the traditional data providers. You know, the gaps around private companies, I think, were discussed earlier on, and certainly that's something we see as an example. Some of the real estate investments, you know, if you're focused on the real estate space, then yeah, sourcing ESG information is going to be a real challenge, and it's not only that sector, but private companies, non-listed companies are a big gap. And I think there's an underlying issue here, which is the lack of incentives for corporates and investees to actually report information. You know, that's evolving, and we heard a little bit from Kikan today about this, around how the landscape's changing with things like CSRD, expanding the scope of firms that will be mandated to report. But you know, today, Dina mentioned this, that the voluntary standards are really what's driving firms to report. And of course, firms can pick and choose the voluntary standards that they want to use, the ones that best represent their interests, not necessarily the most balanced view of their organizations. So really the underlying issue that we see is the lack of a incentive for a broad swathe of the industry to publish this data on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much. Kieran, I wonder whether I can bring you in back into the conversation now. I think you've covered a lot in your presentation, but you obviously have a unique perspective on your end too from a data provider. Can you add to what you've already shared with us in terms of what are those unique challenges? What do you observe from your users? How are they determining what's critical for data management? Yeah, please.
Yeah, no. So I would agree with one thing that I think Dina said, which is that richness of data. We are in a data-rich infrastructure. If to Mark's point, you have the right tools around ML and AI and the ability to scan and process documents, which again, the smaller asset managers really do struggle to get the talent and get the people in because they're in high demand resources. So you'll see larger asset managers be a little bit more forward thinking about that. When we think about the challenges and how smaller scale asset managers and how a lot of private companies, because we see this in our iLevel platform, where we're doing reporting for GPs and LPs. A lot of the times, it's focused in terms of what's required around the asset gathering process. So we'll see a lot of weight placed on the ability to fulfill reports that are either client facing or used in the RFP and evaluation process, because obviously the goal in this investment is to build an accurate process, but the goal of launching these products is to gain assets. So a lot of our clients will tend to focus on the consumptive thing. So I think one of the unique challenges that we see away from quality is the availability. So the ability to kind of address different consuming audiences in different tools. That's been a big focus within our warehouse platform, because what we're trying to do is establish a centralization platform with what we consider authoritative content that can face off to both the regulatory filings, fact sheets, and then this kind of DDQ and RFP process. And the challenge that we see most people struggling with is, especially in the mid and smaller tiers, is they look for more and more guidance. They look for more and more assertions about what's critical. And I think the challenge is that it's different region to region. And that's why we focused on this kind of adaptable set of metrics. So if we're looking at it from a process for an asset manager, it's really about putting them in a position to document what they're doing well from a process and kind of market that out there. We're not trying to greenwash, but we're trying to effectively make that transparent information easier to access across a few different channels. And that seems to be what our users are saying is, you know, with SFDR, how do I manage the disclosure component? Where do I manage that disclosure component? How do I check the data versus the disclosures? Those become the kind of the critical activities for them. Because again, a lot of this data, sometimes they're going to have to go to the vendors and the providers, and they're going to have to work within that framework. If again you've got that larger data backbone and you're really building your own universe the way Aberdeen was, which is what I've seen people like Robeco and other firms do, it's a great position to be in. But that is, to Mark's point, a very rich task in terms of data science, data analytics, and teams kind of constantly scrubbing that. So our focus has been enabling availability.
Excellent. Yeah, and that process focus is really important. But the regulatory factors have really played up as well in terms of the impact on our members. Kikun, I'm not sure whether you're on the line with us still. If you are and you're on the panel, I wanted to pick up on some of the remarks you were making around those regulatory factors that are affecting the sourcing and use of data. And particularly, what is your view? Are we starting to see a convergence in the regulatory requirements? It seemed to me that it's definitely broken down into what's happening in the European space, what's potentially happening in UK. There is the US market too. So are we seeing a convergence? And to what extent, the different standards and approaches to ESG issues across the different markets and territories could undermine actually the objectives of some of the regulatory measures that are being put in place?
Yeah, so I think we are seeing the sort of early signs of convergence. So we have the EU package, which we've talked about today, and then we have that very clear commitment from the UK government and the UK regulators that they are going to bring out their own package that will meet the ambition and the sort of the objectives of that sort of EU package. So we're seeing, if you like, convergence in those respects. And I think where in the past we've had principles and guidelines, and they've played an important, we shouldn't underestimate the role that they have played in establishing some degree of market practice around some of these things, so that when the EU package came along, it wasn't completely new. The concepts were not completely new to the market. And I think that the bigger institutional investors will play quite a large role in driving market practice, in sort of pushing down obligations contractually across the globe. So irrespective of whether a territory has adopted hard legal requirements or softer principles and guidance, if you want access to capital markets, if you want to attract investors, more likely than not, you're going to have to meet some of these obligations that do not apply directly to you, and your ability to apply will depend largely on your ability to assist those investors in meeting their own obligations, their own disclosure obligations that apply to them from their home state regulators and legal systems. So yes, there is fragmentation, but things like the taxonomy, they start to create a global language around things like, environmentally sustainable. We're no longer all referring to different things. We can now point to a definition, and that sort of commonality of a language allows the market to develop, just much in the way that we see in the loan market around things like the LMA, and that how that is a sort of a global standard now in the lending world. I think in respect of ESG requirements, we will see a commonality of language, commonality of themes. There may be nuances, there may be gold-plated standards in some places and more relaxed in others, but I do think we will see, especially around things like with the Paris Agreement and other international commitments, we will see people speaking the same language, which will help drive less fragmentation.
Absolutely. And from standardization, hopefully, and consistency, shall we go back to technology as a potential solution to all of that, which I was really keen to explore. I'd love to hear from our panelists your views on the key factors that will continue to drive that. And in fact, are there any challenges that could be in the path of placing technology at the core of the ESG data solution? Any opportunities that I'm sure you're exploring them already with the solutions you're building for your clients, but where do you see the next stage of that going? Dina, shall I come to you?
Sure. And I think, the point of deploying technology in this space is what can appear very messy has to be organized. So we're back to taxonomy, right? As Kikun was talking, and I think Kieran also, what is that taxonomy that we agree to? And I'm happy to say the global community is slowly converging. The IFRS is now working together with all the GRI, SASB, and the rest of the gang to try to actually standardize corporate ESG disclosure and pushing towards mandated. So the data that comes through the pipeline, if you will, to somebody like us is much more structured, or shall be more structured, which allows us to then more intelligently leverage AI and computer tech and statistics and big data techniques to be able to leverage those patterns. And that's what this is about. So once we identify the patterns, it's quite easy to scale up. It's quite easy to model. It's quite easy to fill the gaps in the data with the data that you can find, and then again, leveraging patterns. So I see, like right now in our organization, I would say we are 3/4 manual, 1/4, let's call it AI. I see that going to 2/3. So going down gradually. We can't do everything with technology. You always have to train the tool. You have to have a good data set to train the tool, if you will. And that's what we're building now by hand. But I see technology, I mean, we can't even imagine all the things that we can do with technology, going into a whole wide range of data and creating integrated models, which is where we need to go right now, from a siloed view of E, S, and G, creating that holistic view of what a company actually does.
And Mark, do you have any views on this one? And I also know that, again, we've got institutions in the audience thinking about how can they embrace technology and what should they be looking for to get the best results for their clients. But the same question as well, do you see any challenges on your path to place technology at the center of the solution, and any tips for our members as they embrace it too?
Sure. Well, I think some of the key factors relate to the increasing demand that we're seeing at the moment. SFDR is a great example. There are so many different consumers now within every organization who need access to ESG data. It isn't just one or two teams. It's vast, it's fast becoming a data set that's almost a master data set that needs to be stored, actively maintained and managed, and then distributed to everyone who needs it in the organization. And that wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago. So the demand, both within organizations, but also organizations of different types who require ESG information, that's also growing exponentially. And I think another factor that's really driving the need for greater technology is scale. Today when we talk about ESG data today, we talk about a large population of companies being 50,000. There are hundreds of millions of companies on the planet, and it isn't just the exchange listed companies who increasingly have a requirement to publish this information and manage this information. Technology is the only thing that's going to help to bridge that gap. I can give a very real example. ESGI as an organization has had to provide anti-slavery policies and anti-bribery and corruption policies as part of onboarding processes. It's key governance documentation. We are far from being an exchange listed company. Well, we'll get closer to it, I'm sure, but we're not an exchange listed company. We're not about to be, so we won't have a reporting obligation, but there's still a need to push this information to organizations. And that will be true for startups, for scale-ups, for organizations of all sizes. So this isn't just a challenge for large corporates. The tail, particularly for GPs and LPs who are interested in investing in smaller companies, for private equity firms, they need information, ESG information, on companies of all shapes and sizes. And today, that's just not possible. Technology has to enable that.
Great. Kieran, Kikun, do you have anything to add on that?
I'd put one quick piece in there because I think both Mark and Dina touched on so many great things. The one thing that we focus in terms of a technology delivery is the concept of both automated and the manual input. That concept that, a quarter or 2/3 of that, in order to really deliver confidence in the centralized information and what you're going to release to investors, the tracking, the ability to kind of reconcile, the ability to look at the ML content or the AI content when you've extracted data from a document and made that a structured data item, people are becoming more and more challenging on those points. So the ability to kind of implement quality rules on what's specifically material, because you can only work so many items, is important. And that's going to change manager to manager, investment vehicle type, portfolio company structure. All of these things factor into what's going to be material in your company. So having the backbone that you can focus on those data items, work those items, and start to track SLAs and track improvement processes. Because a lot of times people think of data validation as what you do today, but it's a process that you have to look at over time, because you need to constantly evaluate what you can better automate, because then you can extend and extend and move that goalpost in terms of getting closer and closer to full automation. So what we try and always track on when we build our platform is the ability to kind of track where people are in their day in the life. What could they be doing better to automate? What are our laggers in terms of activities? And I think getting that into users' hands gets to a better and better end state. And that's something that market's constantly investing in.
Excellent. It's been really fascinating actually to learn and hear your viewpoints on this topic of the role of technology. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and unfortunately we've come to the sort of end of our allocated time. I did want to acknowledge that via the Q&A we have received some specific questions around climate risk measurement, and as always SFDR, it's bound to come up in terms of questions on that specific regulation. And whilst we wanted to keep the discussion more top level, I do want to encourage the audience to get in touch with the IA after this event. We've got a lot of granular work that is happening on all of these topics, including on SFDR. We've got a dedicated SFDR implementation forum, so I'd love to engage with you if you're not already through those forums. But thank you so much for the questions on those ones. And of course, the last one that came up, which I found really interesting, of whether we have any views of adding the T to create an ESG T, as T being technology in that kind of combination. So I found that really intriguing to hear. But thank you so much to the panelists today. We had a very short time to tackle a very big topic. So I hope the audience have found what they've heard today, both by way of presentations from the investment management industry and our speakers and the panelists today, really fascinating, and we'd love to continue the conversations with all of that. But with that, thank you from me. Thank you to the speakers, and I'll pass on to Jill to say a few words of kind of conclusion of the event. Thank you so much, everyone.
I don't think I've got much more to say. I think it's been a fantastic session today. Thank you, Galina, for moderating so brilliantly, and thank you all for all the fascinating insights that we've heard today. Also, I must mention our sponsors, IHS Markit and Clifford Chance. Great to have you with us and joining us today. And as Galina mentioned, if you do have any questions on what we've discussed or would like to find out more, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with the IA or the Engine team, and we can obviously pass on your details to our various speakers where required. So all that's left to say is enjoy the sunshine, and we very much look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Take care. Thank you.